The previous episode ended with the ill-fated MiG-23 Flagger fighter family, which was a consequence of the first fourth-generation Soviet fighter, the MiG-29. The story goes on from this point. The appearance of the fourth-generation US fighters forced the Soviets to give an adequate response. The further upgraded Flagger variant, the MiG-23 MLD, did not solve all the issues to keep up with the next generation of the US fighters. The fruits of the development efforts were an iconic duo, the MiG-29 and the Su-27. These were the first fourth-generation Soviet fighter planes. They were designed with the same aerodynamic conception. The similarities between the shapes of the plane are very apparent. Production of the MiG-29 9.12 variant and the Su-27 started in the early and mid-80s. Both fighters had potential for further development. The declining economy of the Soviet Union and the limitation of the microelectronics industry were the major factors which delayed the better utilization of these new platforms. The concept of the MiG-29 family suffered from some issues which had eventually doomed the whole MiG-29 family. The demand from the Soviet political leadership was design both a larger and a smaller fighter plane, just as happened in the US with the F-15 and F-16. Both fighters, even the smaller one, had to be a twin-engine aircraft. This had very serious consequences, but more on this later. These new Soviet fighters were characterized by amazing flight performance, just like what the F-15 and F-16 had. In this area, they performed to the same level as the American fighters, except for their lower roll rate. Regardless of their top-tier maneuverability, the Soviet planes were designed with a neutral stable aerodynamic design, in contrary with the F-16 and F-18. Where they fell short compared to the F-15 and the F-16 was the absence of real multi-role capability. Both planes were lacking in this department, even by the standards of the late 70s, not even mentioning the later F-18 Hornet. In air-to-air weaponry, they have roughly caught up with the American Team Fighter series, moreover in some areas even surpassed them. The kinematic range of the R-27R semi-active guided air-to-air missile was shorter when compared to the AIM-7F and M Sparrows. The AA-10 LMO, as was called by the West, was available on both new fighters from the beginning. Although the smaller F-16 did not have a beyond visual range air combat missile during the Cold War. The shorter range of the R-27R is a symptom of its significantly larger diameter, which causes larger drag. The AIM-7 has smaller cross-section and its length-diameter ratio is also more optimal. The fact that the R-27R does not have a dual thrust rocket engine is making matters worse for the Soviet missile. The short-range infrared-guided R-73, NATO code and name AA-11 Archer, has a slightly longer kinematic range compared to the AIM-9 Lima and Mike missiles due its size. It is a bit larger and heavier. Similarly to the AIM-9L, it is an all-aspect missile. It can be launched from a much wider zone than its predecessors. From the previous Soviet fighter generations, only the R-60 missile family was available, with the exception of the MiG-23 MLD. The R-60 became available from 1973. The R-60M variant had a much wider launch zone compared to the R-60, the Stone Age R-3S and the upgraded R-13M missile. The R-60M was fielded in the late 70s in the Soviet Union. The R-60 family was available for every MiG-23 except the Export S, MS and the Strike BN variant. The MiG-21 bis also could carry it, being the only fishbed variant capable of doing so. The R-73 introduced a new feature that have been never seen before on any air-to-air missile. It was designed with a thrust vector control capable rocket engine. During the 6 seconds operational time of the engine, this feature had provided unparalleled maneuverability. Against close and high of bore sight targets, this was essential. The target designation was possible using a helmet-mounted sight up to plus 60 degrees of bore sight. This was about twice as high as to what the AIM-9 Lima and Mike variants had. It has to be underlined that the HMS is not a display, it is only a sight and nothing else. Some words about this new capability. While the thrust vector rocket engine was a new thing, the helmet-mounted sight was not at all. It seems most of people think that the first helmet-mounted sight was used by the Soviets. This statement is not entirely correct. The US Navy F-4J fighters, the Block 45 and Block 46 series, and the F-4N featured an additional target designation method with a helmet-mounted sight. Due to the negative experience and feedback from the pilots, the Americans never refined the conception any further. While the combined capability is the first helmet-mounted sight with an AIM-9G or H missile without TVC-capable engine was not comparable with the R-73 plus helmet-mounted sight capability on the new Soviet fighters. It was still the first, however it was very unmatured. Neither the US Navy nor the US Air Force spent any more resources to further develop this conception, at least not during the Cold War. So contrary to popular belief, the Soviets did not reinvent the wheel in this field. However, it cannot be denied that they were the ones who were mass-produced the first usable system which coupled the helmet-mounted sight and the thrust vector-capable missile. The combination of these technologies has provided considerable advantage in close maneuvering air combat over fighters which have lacked this equipment. Another big difference between the Soviet 3rd and 4th generation frontline fighters and American ones was the availability of infrared target search and tracking equipment. On the MiG-29 and the Su-27 the core systems are used. They are housed in the upper nose section before the cockpit canopy. This was the continuation of the trend which have started with the MiG-23. The fighter flogger variants had also an IRST. This piece of information was simply forgotten in the previous episode of this video series. Such IRST device can be useful in some tactical situations, however its usefulness should not be overstated, especially if we are familiar with the capabilities and limitation of the IRSTs of the 70s and 80s. Unlike later systems, the IRSTs of the era did not mean imaging technology. Their working principle was similar to the seeker of an IR-guided missile. The mirror and lens system scanned mechanically just as the radar antenna or a radar dish would do. The biggest difference being that the system has been operating in infrared spectrum instead using radio waves. The CORS system is able to detect multiple targets just as a radar, but in contrary it can't measure the distance and speed of multiple targets. This capability is available with a mechanically scanned radar in track-wise search mode. Such mode was available for American Teen Fighter series from the beginning. The CORS includes a laser rangefinder, but it can only measure the distance of a single target which has already was selected for tracking. The maximum measuring range of the laser rangefinder is 6 km. The maximum detection range of the CORS against incoming targets is about 10 km even in ideal conditions, while in reality the detection range is strongly weather dependent. In case of a rear aspect, the detection range could achieve 25-30 km distance at high altitude, flying above the weather. Considering every factor, we can say it with confidence that the IRST was not suitable for independent target search. In my opinion, the main use of the equipment was on the Su-27 fighter combined with the R-27T infrared guided missile. The kinematic range of the R-27T is almost identical to the R-27R version with semi-active radar guidance. The CORS enables the passive target engagement against descending targets approximately from 2 to 2.5 times longer distance compared to the R-23 missile. It was possible to attack not only from the rear but also from longer distance from the side with passively guided missile. This could be exploited in a ground-controlled interception or with AWACS support. In ideal case, the Su-27 does not have to use its own radar to approach and shove down a target with large enough infrared emission. Here, retroactively I make a small detour to the American planes since the IRST equipment was used on the F-106. From 1963, the Delta Dagger had such a sensor installed in a spherical housing that could be retracted into the nose cone. This equipment was also present on the general-purpose fighters, namely on the F-8 Crusader and the F-4B Phantom. No other US plane has gotten integrated IRST since these fighters, with one exception. In the 70s they were simply discarded, likely because of their questionable cost-benefit ratio. The F-4E Phantom had an electro-optical device called TCO, Target Identification System Electro-Optical. This was a high-magnification black and white TV camera. It didn't have search function, its only role was helping the visual identification in beyond visual range engagements. It could lock on a target which was tracked by radar. It worked in visible light spectrum, therefore it did not provide nighttime capability. Such system was envisioned for the F-15s in the early 70s, but because of fiscal restrictions, eventually it was discarded. The F-14 Tomcat had different sensor configurations during her career. In a certain time, it had special electro-optical sensor, or IRST, or for a period, both. The first system was the AN/AX-1 television camera system, in short the TCS. Essentially, it was a specially instrumented Newton telescope. In clear weather, it provided visual identification capability just like the TCO, but it was far more advanced system. An airliner-sized target could be identified from about 80 kilometers. The difference between an F-5 or a MiG-29 could be noted only from about 20 kilometers. The system had auto search capability. The working principle likely based off contrast difference between the target and the sky. Because of this, likely it was unsuitable for search and tracking in ground clutter. More about this feature in the extra content. The TCS has actually been used in combat. In 1989, it provided visual backup of the Gulf of Sidra incident. The missiles on the Libyan MiG-23s were clearly visible, while Gaddafi stated that US planes downed unarmed planes on a training mission. The TCS in its era provided unparalleled long-range visual identification capability. In the 90s, the final Tomcat variant received a new sensor, the AN/AAS-42 IRST. Only the F-14D variant got this new toy. In contrary to the cause, this was an imaging device. Following this short detour, let's get back to the Soviet fighters. Interestingly, the new fighters were a step backwards compared to the MiG-23 family in some areas. They did not have any kind of precision strike weapon, even the Kh-23 was not available. The air-to-ground inventory was limited to unguided rockets and free-falling bombs, including nuclear bombs. They did not have a real multimode radar, similar to the F-16A Block 1 with the AN/APG-66. The capabilities and the features of the AN/APG-68 of the F-16C was some kind of miracle from the point of view of the Soviets. Due to this shortcoming, the bombing accuracy fell short even in daylight compared to US planes. The nighttime strike capability was non-existent thing for the Soviet fighters. The new Soviet fighters could be considered single-role planes until the end of the Cold War. In air-to-air mode, their radars were a big leap forward. Only the last iteration of the MiG-23, the MLD variant, had comparable radar to the MiG-29's radar. The larger antenna of the N001 radar on the Su-27 provided an unparalleled detection range among the frontline fighters. Except the MiG-21PF, the gun was an integral part of the weaponry of the Soviet frontline fighters. Both new fighters got a new type of gun. The caliber of the GSH-301 gun increased to 30mm, the twin-barrel design of the GSH-23-2 was replaced by a single-barrel type cannon. The rate of fire halved, but in exchange, the destruction power of a single round dramatically increased. The other area where the progress was not equal was the combat radius. Because of the previously mentioned twin-engine specification, the MiG-29 became a very strange fighter. Because of the low ground clearance of the airframe and intakes, the MiG-29 has an additional air intake on the upper side of the leading edge root extension. During taxi and takeoff, the engines receives air through this alternative intake route to prevent foreign object damage of the engines. The twin-engine design demanded a much larger and heavier airframe to accommodate the two RD-33 engines compared to the single-engine design with the larger AL-31F engine. These factors led to such a fighter where a 24,000-pound heavy plane has the same internal fuel as the 60,500-pound heavy F-16A Block 1. Also, while the F-16A has 4 underwing and 1 centerline hardpoint, the much heavier MiG-29 has 1 less underwing hardpoint on each side. The F-16 can carry 2 additional drop tanks with the same number of air-to-air missiles. Moreover, the Cold War MiG-29 variants only have a centerline drop tank. The combined factor of these resulted that the new fighter has a combat radius barely above the MiG-21 bis, while the new MiG fighter is roughly twice as heavy as the MiG-21 bis was. Even if the MiG-29 had underwing drop tanks on the inner wing hardpoints, it would mean it lost BVR air combat capability. The high-altitude combat radius of the MiG-29 was about 30% less compared to the MiG-24 MF and ML variants. The Su-27 had a vastly different design conception compared to any previous frontline fighter. It does not have the option to carry drop tanks on any hardpoint. Thanks to her sheer size, the internal fuel load was far beyond of any other fighter in the 80s. Compared to the 27,500 pound empty weight of the F-15A, the Su-27 is 36,000 pound. For exchange, the internal fuel of the flanker is almost 25,000 pound compared to the 11,500 of the F-15A. The F-15C has a slightly higher fuel capacity, 13,500 pound internal fuel. No matter that the Tomcat was heavier, the 40,000 pound F-15A had only 60,000 pound of internal fuel. So while the performance of the Su-27 is not degraded by the drop tank or drop tanks, in exchange the empty weight and the cross-section of the flanker is larger than the Eagle's. The cockpit of the Su-27 and the MiG-29 are very similar, but they are not identical. The lag behind the US fighter planes is very apparent. The cockpit instrumentation, the human-machine interface of the new Soviet fighters, was on the level of the early mid-70s US fighters at best, like the F-14A, F-15A or the F-16A Block 1. Multifunctional displays are completely missing from the Soviet planes, while the F-18A and F-16 Block 25 had in the mid-80s. Even the F-16 had at least one multifunction display. The HUD of the Soviet fighters provides far less information compared to the 4th generation US fighters except the F-14. Even the F-14B did not have a real HUD. The visibility from the pit is equal or almost equal to the US fighters. The field of view is generally great, only the cockpit frame blocks the view like on the Hornet or the Eagle. Only the F-16 is better with its frameless cockpit canopy. The navigational systems of the planes were improved compared to the MiG-23, but they still have mechanical inertial navigation system, not the laser gyroscopic type. The system could store and handle only a very few navigational points or radio beacon. It could be counted on a single hand on the MiG-29, while the system is not reprogrammable in the air. The new fighters had the same radio beacon navigational modes as older planes and some autopilot modes. At least the Su-27 can display the route and the programmed waypoints on a TV screen. The self-defense capability of the planes was a considerable leap ahead. The dispenser cartridges are an integral part of the planes from the beginning, as well as the radar warning receiver. However, the location of the RVR instrument on both planes says a lot about its effectiveness and its secondary importance. It is on the right side on the front board, at the height of the right knee of the pilot. On the US or other NATO planes, the RVR is generally in the main field of view of the pilot, near to the HUD, but at least at the same elevation. The MiG-29 9.12 does not have integrated electronic countermeasure system, not even as an option as a pod. The 9.13 variant, just before the end of the Cold War, received the electronic countermeasures package. The Su-27 is able to carry a pair of jamming pods on the wingtip, but in this case the air-to-air armament is reduced by 2 R-73 missiles. This is not a big deal if you ask me. Even with the ECM pods, the Su-27 still can have the same 4+4 short and medium range air-to-air missiles like the F-15. The flight performance of the new fighters was the only area where the success was clearly evident. The dogfight performance of the planes was literally identical with the best US fighters, with the F-16s and F-15s and above the Hornet and even the F-13B. The performance is supported by the next generation engine types. The AR-31F on the Su-27 and the RD-33 on the MiG-29. By the way, the frontal aviation branch entered into a new era because these engines were turbofan types. However, no matter of being next generation engine, the RD-33 has a notable, very visible disadvantage. It produces thick black smoke at high thrust setting up to max military power. During the transition between the beyond visual range and the within visual range combat, it makes much easier to spot the plane compared to any other fighter. No matter the hard efforts, the new Soviet planes were considerably restricted or inferior in many areas compared to the 4th generation US fighters, considering even their first iteration. The Soviet planes achieved initial operation capability 6-8 years later than the F-15A and F-16A Block 1. The new fighters surpassed their predecessor in almost every area except the range of the MiG-29. The only area where the Soviet planes had clear advantage over the new American fighters is the high off-board sight capability, thanks to the combination of the R-73 and the helmet-mounted sight. It is worth to look beyond the main features of the fighter planes and make a comparison between the availability considering the date of initial operation capability and manufactured quantity. The F-14 is excluded for the comparison because it did not have a Soviet counterpart. Also, it would make the comparison even more unfair as the contrast would even more be pronounced. The production of the MiG-29 started in 1982. From its two main variants, about 1,200 were delivered until 1990. Following the collapse and dissolution of the Soviet Union, more than 100 airframes remained in the assembly plants in different stages of completion. What about the flanker? 510 airframes were delivered until 1990, but until end of 1984 only 52. The pace of manufacturing ramped up only in the second half of the 80s. Meanwhile, more than 2,000 F-16s were manufactured since the late 70s until the end of the Cold War. The export of the F-16A planes in NATO and other countries started in the early 80s. Israel conducted the airstrike against Iraq in June of 1981 using F-16A Block 1 planes, which were escorted by F-15 fighters. From the Eagle family, also a large quantity was produced: 384 F-15A, 483 F-15C, in total 867 airframes. Besides these, 61 and 92 B and D trainer variants were also built, which in contrary to MiG-29UB and Su-27UB, they are fully combat-capable variant. Only the electronic countermeasure equipment is missing from the two-seater planes. All of these planes were delivered until 1985. The first batch of the F-15C variant was produced in 1976, so until that point all F-15A and B planes were delivered and the production of the F-16 had been already ongoing. There is a clearly visible gap between the development and production capability between the US and the Soviet Union. By the time the production of the MiGs and Sukhois ramped up in the mid-80s, in the US more than 1,000 F-15s and more than 1,000 F-16 have already been manufactured. The majority of these planes flew in the US Air Force and European NATO countries. The development and production of both new Soviet fighters lagged behind the new generation American planes. Also, only upgraded versions of the Su-27 and MiG-29 could be considered real multi-role 4th generation fighters from an American perspective. But the decline and subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union prevented their production and acquisition for a long time, at least for Russia. Apart from the two superpowers, only one other country developed what can be considered a new generation fighter. It was France. This was the Mirage 2000 family, the first version of which, version C, entered service from the mid-80s. In terms of flight performance and avionics, the Mirage falls into the category of 4th generation fighters, more or less. Although it had a new engine, a quite advanced cockpit and BVR capability with a new missile, the legacy of the Mirage 3 family cannot be denied. The Mirage 2000 retained the delta wing design. Her basic aerodynamic design did not represent a revolution. Also, the C variant was not a multi-role fighter. However, the Mirage 2000C could use unguided bombs and rockets, just as the F-15s, but this was similarly a non-utilist capability as happened with the Eagle. The D variant was designed for a dedicated strike role with two-man crew. What is hard to understand, at least to me, the surprisingly low quantity of the carried air-to-air weapons. It consisted only two short-range infrared R550 Magic II and two medium-range semi-active radiant-guided Super 530D missiles. Moreover, windrop tanks could only be carried on the hardpoints of the Super 530 missiles. If the plane carried them, it had only short-range infrared-guided missile and only two. This is very strange considering the amount of hardpoints for bombs and loadout of the later Mirage 2000 variants. Now we are at the end of the 80s. The appearance of the F-15E and the F-16 Block 4042 changed forever what can be called a multi-role fighter. But this is a story for another time. If you like the video, you can share, like, subscribe or ring the bell and follow the channel. You can support it via Patreon for exchange for early access video, voting on planned topics, and extra content is available and regular updates about the project. So far 6 extra documents were released, their description is in the link under the video.